Welcome back. I want to thank everyone, not just on the panels, but also those of you in the audience for a really jam-packed morning. I will say that as we planned this meeting, I was very confident in the quality of the panels. In some ways, the quality of the folks that we've been working with and the interesting nature of these issues makes it like shooting fish in a barrel in this field. And as someone who is an election geek for a living, it really has been a pleasure to be a part of not just planning this meeting, but working with the folks on the future of California elections, FOS or FOSE, depending on your language preference. My name is Doug Chapin. I'm Director of the Future of California Elections. It's been a real opportunity and honor to work with all of the folks, not just on the group, but with many of you over the last year or so and before that. So I really am, I'm grateful that you all came. I'm grateful that so many of you stayed. I hope you enjoyed lunch. We've enjoyed putting the program together for you. What we wanted to do now, we've talked a lot about things that are kind of already on the agenda for California election policymakers and election officials and the people who love them across the country. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to acknowledge, in the words of the bard John Lennon, that sometimes life is what happens to you while you are making other plans. And I know that folks in California are familiar with the potential for Mother Nature to throw you a curveball from time to time, whether it's an earthquake or a fire or some other kind of natural disaster. Those of us who pay attention to elections, I think we're very much riveted by what happened on the Atlantic seaboard, especially in New York State and New Jersey with Hurricane or Superstorm Sandy. And so as we thought about giving you all something to chew on, not just off your plates, but through your ears at lunchtime, was to think about what does it mean to be prepared in an emergency if you are an election official or someone in the field of elections. And I'm delighted to say that we were able to pull together a very distinguished and very knowledgeable panel. I'm going to introduce them all very briefly now and then offer just some transition remarks in between. But we have with us Nancy Ward from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. We have my friend Pam Smith from Verified Voting, Jill LaVine, Sacramento County election official who has been gracious enough to host FOS and really has been very helpful, not just in this meeting, but a lot of the work that we've done. And last but never least, Evan Goldberg with the California Secretary of State's office. And what we've asked them each to do is just talk for a few minutes about some of the issues that could come up with emergency preparedness, whether it's dealing with a natural disaster or man-made in elections. And the idea here is not to solve all the problems because we never know what the issues are going to be, but to start a conversation both on the panel and with those of you in the room and outside of it about what we need to do to be prepared as an election community for what happens when life happens and we were making other plans. So I will start with Nancy Ward, who is Regional Administrator for Region 9 of FEMA, based here in the Bay Area. She has had postings in Washington and elsewhere, is very familiar with emergency response, not just here on the West Coast, but across the country. And she is what those of us who have worked in Washington would call a great get for a panel like this. So I'm happy to invite her to the podium. Nancy?
Well, thank you, Doug, and thank you for the opportunity to be on your panel today. I'm not from the elections world, so this is a rare and unique opportunity for me to be able to chat with you today. And I want to begin by applauding the panel for having this topic in their program. It's not only timely, but incredibly important. And I was impressed as I listened to the last two panels with the dedicated passion and effort that you all are doing on a day-to-day basis. And I hope that, at least if you haven't already, that after the discussion today, that you will be putting contingency planning and disaster preparedness in your toolkit as well. And I'll tell you that preparedness and preparation and contingency planning is the single most important tool that you can do to protect the rights of the citizens to vote following a disaster. As Doug mentioned, in October, when Hurricane Sandy made landfall, it caused 8 million homes, businesses, entities to be without power over a multi-state region. For many in the New Jersey and the New York areas, like the Rockaways, Queens, Long Island, people's homes had to be evacuated. Homes were destroyed and severely damaged by the devastating winds, flooding, and the fires. Or whose polling places that they regularly went to for voting were destroyed or rendered unusable just days before a major election. And for many in the most devastated areas, the election was only one important issue amongst the many life safety issues that they were dealing with: shelter, food and water, medicine, medical prescriptions, not only medical treatment, fuel, power, and heat. Shortly after the hurricane, a nor'easter went through the impacted states with temperatures dipping into the single digits, dropping snow amongst all of the impacted areas, and creating another 150,000 without power. And as you recall, many of the widespread speculation back then was that the election would have to somehow be postponed. You can imagine that without power or heat, working restrooms, even a facility to have an election, you can begin to imagine the challenges faced by those who had to work very quickly in dire circumstances to get hundreds of polling places identified and up and running before Election Day. FEMA worked with the state of New York to procure a contract on Saturday before the election to get more than 225 polling places identified and up and running by 6 a.m. election morning. An enormously daunting task in 72 hours. Determining multiple alternate polling places in advance of a disaster is probably one of your best tools to have in your toolkit. Fuel was one of the greatest logistical challenges in all of the Hurricane Sandy response. And when we think of fuel, we think of first responders not having fuel, or folks needing to evacuate not having fuel. But when your voting machines are being powered by generators, fuel was as an important issue to the elections officials as it was to the first responders. In addition, many responders, National Guardsmen from out of state, utility workers that came from as far as Hawaii, didn't make preparations to be out of state, didn't apply for absentee ballots, and many of them didn't get to vote. And as the administrator of FEMA Region 9, I would be remiss if I talked about Hurricane Sandy and the devastation and not hit on what Doug talked about in terms of what the vulnerabilities and the risks are in California. If you're a California resident, you're familiar with earthquakes. And it's agreed upon in the emergency management community, as it is in the scientific community, that a major, devastating, catastrophic earthquake will happen in our lifetimes. So prudently, FEMA has been preparing for the big one in California for quite some time. As an example, our Southern California catastrophic earthquake plan projects a seismic event in which 1,800 residents will perish, 53,000 would be injured, 300,000 buildings would be severely damaged or destroyed, and $213 billion in damages. That could certainly wreck an election day, right? And those numbers seem staggering and maybe even an alarmist stage level until the 2011 Japan earthquake and tsunami hit, and those numbers were quadrupled of the impacts, more than $10 trillion in damages. But we also have concerns in Northern California, both in the Greater Bay Monterey coast and the Mendocino coast as well. And that's just the earthquake risk. As Doug said, we have widespread flooding that we have potentials for, tsunamis down in Pam's area, and the devastating firestorms that we've seen all throughout California can plague California and really interrupt an election process. And I don't bring all of this up to scare anyone or to be an alarmist, quite frankly, but to point you to the real risk that California faces, and that your jobs really need to be as attuned to helping prepare for what may happen as it is for all of the dialogue that you've had up until today at noon in your previous panels. And the good news is that California has had a long distinguished leadership in emergency management and emergency preparedness. We've messaged probably more than anywhere in the nation to our personal citizens, our civic leaders, and our business communities about preparing and contingency planning for all that they do. And for those of you election officials in the counties who have not sat down with your emergency management officials in your county, I would implore you to do so. We have a great network in California in the standardized emergency management system, and a great ability for you to integrate into those planning concepts that we all know are so incredibly important before, during, and after an event. And I would also implore you to take the lessons learned from Sandy and correlate that into your plans, or develop a plan based on what's happened out there. It is a very, very recent image that you all can take back and work toward establishing your contingency plans. And while my message today is prepare, 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 I'll just tell you, it doesn't happen in a day. It doesn't start with just wanting to ensure that you have a risk. It takes the collaboration that I've seen from the last two panels. This is an incredible conference, and I'm very, very impressed with your passion and your dedication. And I hope, again, that you will include contingency planning and preparedness for disasters in what you do each and every day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Next up, Pam Smith. Nancy mentioned some of the threats to the physical infrastructure when we are trying to conduct elections in the wake of a disaster. Our next speaker, Pam Smith from Verified Voting, I think is uniquely qualified to talk about the threats to some of the technological infrastructure. I think anyone who pays attention to election administration in this country has got to admit that in the last decade or so, technology is playing a much larger role in the process than it ever has. Whether we're talking about online voter registration or electronic voting machines, the nature of the technology we use to register voters and cast and count ballots is increasingly important. And contingencies challenge that technical infrastructure in a way that I don't think everybody appreciates. Fortunately for me and for all of you, I think Pam Smith does, and she is going to talk to us a little bit about her work, not just in the wake of Superstorm Sandy, but also in the field of elections generally. Pam?
Thanks, Doug. I don't purport to know everything there is to know about this, and it was an interesting lesson when Hurricane Sandy left the region without electricity and interrupted transportation routes and the mail and communications. You know, that's a litany of things, but when I say transportation routes, I mean, you know, the delivery path for the voting machines. And when I say electricity, it's the thing you plug the voting machines into. And when I say the communications channels, it's the thing that lets you get in touch with your poll workers, who, by the way, can't get through on those transportation routes either. So it was sort of, you know, what happens when all heck breaks loose all at the same time. Bob Giles he's the elections director in New Jersey, was heard on a panel recently saying, yes, but to almost everything that someone could raise as, well, you could do this. Yeah, except. And it was really difficult to fathom, I think, for some of us, the surprising number of possible contingencies that can come up. You know, not just things like Sandy. There was a 3-alarm blaze in a football field-sized warehouse in Harris County, Texas, that burned 10,000 voting machines in 2010, 51 days before the start of early voting for their election. And 9/11/2001 was primary day in New York City, something that is often forgotten as we think back about that day. So Murphy's Law applies to elections just as much as it does to other areas of life. If it can go wrong, there's a good chance it might. But election officials know that, and many of them try to anticipate such predicaments in advance. So what if you lose a polling place? Is there a backup option? Can you consolidate? What if your poll workers don't show up? Can you get someone else there? What if the power goes out? Can you keep equipment running beyond its battery life? What if all your equipment's unavailable? How can voters vote? What if all those things happen? We did publish a report last year with partners from Rutgers and Common Cause called Counting Votes 2012, a state-by-state look at election preparedness. And among other things, the report looked at contingency plans in a very limited, narrow focus for jurisdictions that rely on a machine interface for marking ballots, and what the plans were for repairing or replacing equipment that was broken or failed on election day, such as providing emergency paper ballots to voters, and when they do that, and other provisions they might have. It wasn't a comprehensive study, and that's kind of the key point. It's just one piece of this larger puzzle. Sandy was exponential, as I said, and if you've got all your poll sites underwater, you do really remarkably creative things, like they used military vehicles for these high water military trucks to create new polling places where the old polling places actually were, but there wasn't any power. So you could actually go into this big vehicle and vote in there on paper, which Governor Christie described at the time as old school. But hey, just like in rock and roll, old school is all right. Other states do things like Colorado has put together a disaster planning guide for election officials. The Wisconsin Elections Board put one together back in 2007, actually, and they actually have in statutes a procedure for adjourning to an alternate polling site. It's the one frequently asked question in their guide was, what do you do when you have to adjourn to an alternate polling site? So they have an answer for that, and it's in statute. Indiana developed and issued an elections and polling place emergency preparedness guide right about the time Sandy was bearing down. Not on Indiana, but on other states. So they said, we should be thinking about this, and they did. And there's always going to be elections poorly timed to coincide with disasters, and vice versa. But there are some things we can do and think about what the plans are in advance, what should happen. The Election Assistance Commission on the federal level does provide some guidance as to how to plan for emergencies and contingencies and disasters. And I think that the key here is making the space and making the time to be able to do that. Now, on a state level, it may happen in some states. On a county level, it often happens, and you'll hear about that from my colleague here in a moment. In New Jersey, to use them as an example, there were some extended deadlines to accommodate the interruption in voter schedules, including processing requests for mail-in ballots, which were normally accepted until a week before the election, but they extended that deadline. They made these alternate polling places available, as I said. They allowed voters to vote from any polling place that they could possibly get to. So there was, of course, an increase in provisional ballots, but they did enable the voting for everybody. That was something that New York also did. There was one well-intentioned but problematic provision that was offered by the Elections Division in New Jersey, which was to offer affected voters the option of returning a voted ballot over the internet, specifically email or fax in this case. Now, New Jersey already allowed email return of voted ballots for a very limited number of voters, military and overseas voters in particular. New Jersey is the only state allowing email return of voted ballots to also require the physical ballot be returned, which makes that an accountable, recountable ballot. But apart from the security issues involved with transmitting votes over the internet, the process itself didn't work very well. It didn't translate very well to expanding this option on short notice for a lot more voters. There were sort of this sudden influx of requests. Oh yeah, I could do that. Well, I'll vote by email. So it was a multi-step process. You had to first make the request, then they would send you something. You would fill that out to authenticate yourself. Then they would send you a ballot. Then you would fill out the ballot and scan it and upload it and send it back. What could possibly go wrong? So you send your request and you don't get an answer and you think, I'll send it again. Or you send your ballot and you don't get a confirmation, so, I'll send it again. That's like a megabyte graphic file that nobody's reduced in size, and so the server's immediately overloaded, and one election official who was really trying hard to make sure people could vote said, you can use my Hotmail address. Okay, so anyway, in the end, other states didn't resort to using that methodology, but instead did expand the option of voters to be able to vote from anywhere. And one of the things that we thought was a good idea in this scenario is to use the technology to get blank ballots to voters, and especially also including displaced voters who have gone somewhere else to help people who have been affected by disasters and didn't have time to request an absentee ballot. We think that's a safer way to use the technology and would prevent the overload on the clerks' systems to just do this in one direction. Also allowing ballots that are received after Election Day to be included in the count, as long as they were postmarked or dropped in the mailbox before the close of Election Day. I should say this reminded me of a famous disaster in Chicago, where I hail from, when the Chicago River flooded. Nobody noticed because it didn't flood the streets. It actually flooded underground, but all kinds of, most of the downtown area had to shut down, and this happened right before tax day. And so all the accountants working on tax returns, et cetera, couldn't, finish the work in time for tax day. So that year, if you were affected by the Chicago River flood, you could put Chicago River on your tax return and send it in a few days late. It was the only year you could do that. California, obviously the earthquake challenge, fires. In October of 2007, fortunately, I don't think it was right before an election. Deborah Seiler will probably correct me if I'm wrong, but there were forest fires on 3 flanks of where I lived in San Diego County, and it was pretty frightening. Flooding, of course, tsunami affecting coastal regions, who knows? But I think the key here is working together, both state and county and advocacy and lawmakers and policymakers all collaborating to find the best ways to be prepared in advance, to think about these things in advance. Kathy said earlier, if you say it, it's a committee. But there is already qualified people working on this, as you're about to hear from my colleague from flood-prone Sacramento, but we are ready to contribute to the effort. So thank you.
Thank you, Pam. And next up, Jill LaVine from Sacramento County. Jill really is a great example of the kind of work that election administrators do. I've had the good fortune to tour her office, and the little things count, and Jill and her staff pay attention to them lovingly and fanatically. So it really is an honor to have her on this panel to talk about what happens when the little things are upset by a big thing, or maybe even the big one. Jill?
Thank you, Doug. I find it interesting that I'm known as being able to handle a disaster, so I was like, oh, what's my life been like? So anyway, what would happen if, and those are the things that keep you awake at night, and as many election officials know, especially around election time, you don't get much sleep worrying about the what ifs. And there's a lot of lessons learned, like they talked about, the lessons learned from New York. And it's great that we go to conferences such as this and we can learn from those that were actually affected by those problems in New York and what they did and what they wish they had done ahead of time. From Louisiana, we learned that not always does the water come in from the roof. It sometimes comes in from the bottom, and so to keep all your documents a little higher and not put them on the floor. Hurricane Sandy, if you see the pictures, we never thought about adding a sand test to our voting equipment. But as you can see in their equipment, it got pretty dirty, and yet they still had to use it on Election Day. And it worked. That's the best part. Generators, that type of things. And do we have, we've got one for the office, but do we have one for a polling place if we needed to send them out? So a few years ago, our county asked us to put together some disaster contingency plans in case what if. Now, that was easy, not a problem. Every department put together just about the same plan. We'd all go to the General Service Department, we'd all get the vehicles from there, and we'd all call IT to restore everything. Well, I guess when the county got all the plans and they all looked alike, they realized they didn't have enough equipment at General Services, and what if the IT department was also having a disaster? So they kind of send us back to the drawing board and says, what if you don't have those resources? What are you going to do? So back to the drawing board. And the bad part is when you're trying to plan, like they said, you don't know what you're planning for. You don't know if you're planning for a flood, an earthquake, a forest fire. I mean, because each time you plan, the answers are different, you know. And when is it going to happen? Is it going to happen on election day, before election day, any time for recovery, any time, you know. So the plans have to be well thought out, well prepared, and in stages of if it happens before, after, or during the election time. And it doesn't have to be a big disaster. We have found that rattlesnakes at polling places can cause a disaster. Bee swarms, that one was bad. Gas leaks at polling places, school lockdowns, they all cause problems. It can be the flu. It can be leaky windows that cause mold and you have to relocate your office. So, my office understands that one. So with all of those different types of things that could happen, we put together a binder of information. Now this binder of information, it's about a 1-inch, 3-inch, 1-inch big, 3-ring binder. And in it is some extremely valuable information. And it is updated prior to each election with some, make sure everything is current. And we are to keep those with us. We are to put them in the car. We're to carry them on our person and basically have them in case there is a disaster and we can't get back into the office. We have all the phone numbers we need. Now, my secretary knows me very well. She includes a plastic bag for me to put mine in because I'm a mess. So, anyway, in my binder, I have phone numbers and email addresses of each of my staff and their home, their work, their cell, their home cell, and their spouses if necessary. And while our office is pretty small, we have an organization chart, so I kind of know who would be next in line to call because I know it, but in a disaster, would I know it, that type of thing. I have our Board of Supervisors phone numbers. I have their Chief of Staff and any other phone number that they want to give me. Emergency numbers, of course, the sheriff, the fire department, Secretary of State. I have my county council's home phone number because if I have to make a decision, I need to make sure I can reach them at home. And of course, many of our county IT departments, depending on the software, hardware, whatever we need. I have other department directors in the county because if I need to call general services and I need a truck that maybe nobody else is borrowing, I have their phone number. I have the city council's phone numbers, names and phone numbers, because if the election is affecting them too, I need to make sure I can reach out to them. I have the media's phone number. The media may be your best source to get the information out to your voters. Then I have my vendors, my printing vendor, my voting system vendor, my software vendor, and I have as many of those phone numbers as I can get. You don't want the front reception number, you want the person that will answer the phone and be able to help you. And some of those numbers are confidential, so this book is a semi-confidential book. I don't want it to be put out to everybody. Now, also in this book, I have a map. I have a map that locates each one of my employees. Because Sacramento, with the 2 rivers running through it, and you have to get across the river to get to one thing or another, I need to know who lives on what side of the river in case I need their help. So I know who lives the closest, who lives on what side of the river, and those types of things. I have a building planned, so I know which door numbers of each of the building in case the alarms are going off or if I need some assistance. I have a map of where we evacuate to. If I'm in the office, that's great, but I may not need it otherwise. And I have a map to our Office of Emergency Services. I know where they are, but in times of, a problem, I may need to have the map right there in front of me. Also in this binder, I have emergency plans and policies and procedures, such as bomb threats, evacuation plans, earthquakes, some just general plans, and of course the federal plan that they have put out. I have a memo from the Secretary of State of some very important code sections that I may need to use. I have MOUs from other counties. We have worked with counties that are close to us that have the same type of voting system. that an MOU that's saying we can come and count our ballots there, or maybe use some of their equipment. And it is signed by my board, and it is signed by their board. So all of that is planned, prepared, and ready to go. For each election, I have a list of the polling places, because those change, and great if it's on the computer, but a hard copy in your hand is also good. We also have an agreement with our Office of Emergency Service. We actually take a copy of our election definition to their office, and a couple of our scanners. So in case something should happen to our office, we can reconstruct the election. It will be very time consuming and very slow for counting, but we could do that. And in preparation, I have attended training, because you never know what's going to happen, and they have offered the training, so we made sure that we attended the training. We have badges already ready for the Office of Emergency Services, so I don't have to arrive there and say, oh gee, I can't get in the door now. I actually have the badge prepared and ready to go. We also meet with the sheriff prior to each election. We give them a list of our polling places. So if there is any problem, they know how to, we might want to give them a heads up on a couple. We've done that in the past. A few more drive-bys, or a sheriff in the area is always helpful in case, we know there's going to be an issue. So basically, the binder is just preparation. We don't know what's going to happen, but as much information as we can get in that binder and have with us is what we've done. So preparation, like you said. Thank you.
I wasn't kidding about being big on the little things. That I can imagine how valuable that binder is. And last, we have Evan Goldberg, Chief Deputy Secretary of State. The Secretary of State's office has been a tremendous partner to us on many of the topics on which we've already been working, and I know that really even before Sandy, but especially in the wake of Sandy, that Evan and folks like him across the country are probably thinking about what sorts of changes might be necessary in California to address some of the contingencies that arose in Sandy or in the wake of other disasters like it. So, Evan?
Oh, thank you, Doug. When Nancy mentioned Superstorm Sandy, the first thing I thought of is the Loma Prieta quake from '89. So it's been almost 24 years, and that was October 17th. So that would have been 2 to 3 weeks before a general election if it had been 1 year sooner or 1 year later. Logistics, of course, are critical. The other piece, of course, is what you can do within the confines of the law. In California, I think we're ahead of some of the things they had to do on the fly in New Jersey. I think our laws are flexible enough in that they allow county elections officials in some circumstances, and the governor during declared states of emergency and other circumstances, to respond when a disaster does strike. And that includes everything from like a superstorm Sandy, natural disaster, to things like Jill mentioned, rattlesnakes and bees, or there was a case, I think it was in 2008, when there was a gunman loose in an area, and so the police, I think this was in Monterey County, where the police had to cordon off an area for virtually an entire day, so a polling place had to be relocated. Just a couple of examples from the county side, which is county elections officials have the ability to relocate a polling place as late as election day. They can do it on the fly if need be. And from a voter perspective, voters can apply for a vote by mail ballot up until election day as well. So New Jersey had to make that up on the fly. Our normal cutoff is E-7, but in certain circumstances you can apply for a ballot up until election day. If the governor declares a state of emergency in the state, of course the powers are broader. The governor, he or she, whoever's in office at the time, has the ability to extend polling areas, has the ability to waive laws to enable ballots to be returned after election day, has the ability to permit any voter to vote in any polling place in the state. Current law, you can already do it, as you all know, using a provisional ballot in county. There's also a provision that was put in the code a couple of years ago where emergency workers who may be from, say, Placer County down in LA County on election day in an area where there's a declared state of emergency, they can go into an LA County polling place and vote a ballot. The law certainly does not address every single situation. We saw that during Hurricane Sandy, of course, where Californians who did not apply for a vote-by-mail ballot because they anticipated being back from the East Coast prior to Election Day didn't think to apply for a vote-by-mail ballot. And even the exception where you can apply for one up until Election Day doesn't do them any good because it's not possible to get them a ballot to the East Coast and back prior to the polls closing. I'm not sure the law, though, can account or make allowances for every single situation because, as you all know, in elections generally, it's kind of a balancing act between the need to provide access with the need to ensure the integrity of the overall election. And that's a general concept, and I don't think that concept can be reduced even in a crisis situation. I think as Nancy and Pam and Jill all pointed out, planning is the key. The more planning you can do in advance, then the less you have to make up on the fly. And during any kind of a disaster, there's going to be a certain amount you have to make up on the fly.
Great. Thank you, Evan. We don't have a whole lot of time for questions because I do want to try and keep us on track for the afternoon. One thing before, and I'm just going to take the privilege and ask one question, and then if other folks want to get in a very short queue, we can do that. We know from the experience around the country that three things are virtually certain on Election Day, and I've seen this in our work at Election Line. A poll worker somewhere is going to punch someone else, whether a voter or another poll worker. Someone is going to drive a car into a polling place. It will happen. And almost always someone will phone in a bomb threat that will cause one polling place or another to close. Again, in the grand scheme of things, international election, not a big deal, but if that's your polling place on your election day, it can be a big deal. I'm curious, each member of the panel, just really quickly, what's one thing that election officials might not have thought of that they might consider doing to prepare for contingencies, either natural or man-made disasters?
Fumigation comes to mind. This last election, we heard about ballots not working in scanners because spiders had taken up residence. Now, that's a joke, but seriously, they had. I think, the contingency, the most effective contingency is empowering your poll workers. Having poll workers who know what the right thing is to do and are willing to step up and do it and feel confident that they'll be backed up by their election official when they do it is a really critical thing. And it can solve a lot of problems, even simple problems like long lines, if they do that and they know to do that. Having enough emergency ballots and deploying them quickly so that you don't turn a small disaster into a big disaster, I think is really useful, and having redundancy of systems is really useful.
Well, I'm listening and learning, but I would say some generators to have on hand to send out to polling places, and of course the fuel to power them. In this situation, everybody, if the disaster happened in New York and New Jersey, and everybody went to Home Depot and bought generators for their own self, and then there was nothing left to buy. So in order to get enough, they had to kind of start in this, our vendor ES&S actually started in Omaha and they must have stopped at each Home Depot all the way across to get to New York to get enough generators to help out some of these counties. So you can't just wait till the disaster happens, think, oh, I can run to the store and get that. You've got to have it already in your office.
I think I would say that in an event that is declared a disaster, there are things that FEMA can help with, and not a lot of people know that or anticipate that that can happen. And so in the heat of the moment, we can help with generators, we can help with fuel, we can help with obtaining alternate polling locations, we can help with public messaging, getting printed materials out of alternate locations, distributing those pamphlets or flyers to get the word out. Those are some of the things that FEMA can help. The downside of what I'm saying is, in some of what the other panel members have talked about, where it's a one polling place or one county issue, the likelihood of that becoming a presidentially declared disaster is probably slim. But if it is a widespread event, that there are things that FEMA can do to help.
I don't think there's one thing I would say they're most likely to forget. I think remembering everything, though, and then having the funds or the ability to implement it are two different things. If you don't have the money to buy backup generators, you don't have the money. And I know in many counties, they have difficulty finding polling sites as it is, so finding alternate polling sites, I would imagine would be a challenge. Those are two things that pop to mind.
Okay, great. I would say, based on my my clock, that we've got time for maybe 3 questions, if they are questions to start with. So right here.
Hi, this is a real question. Lee Lundgren from Stanislaus County. And my question is, does FEMA help in all elections or only federal? And the second one is, what's your number, or how do we get FEMA?
FEMA doesn't distinguish between a state election or a federal election. What FEMA is concerned about is it a declared disaster? So that's the key, a presidentially declared disaster. There's several levels of those. Start, as Evan talked about, with the state of emergency declared by the governor. And your regional office is in Oakland, and we're on the internet and in the book. But I would start with your local emergency services, as Sacramento County has. That's actually just a phenomenal rendition of a well-prepared emergency kit.
And I think that's really important to note, is that you see, in the wake of a disaster, you often see questions about whether or not it will actually be declared a disaster. And it's not just for media purposes that to sort of verify that it's a really big disaster. There's actually a legal basis for the declaration that these folks want to help, but they are not authorized to help until the president says, I declare that a
I
disaster.
will say that we have, in some cases, because we do have warehouses of generators strategically placed around the country, if an event rose to the occasion and it was undetermined at the time that the polling places needed generators, we have entered into agreements with the state of California and other states to lend generators to them, and that if it doesn't get declared, they just reimburse us for returning them back to FEMA and making them mission capable for the next event.
Hi, I'm Bill Schultz from El Dorado County, Registrar. You know, El Dorado County is a rural county. We're challenged sometimes in November elections by heavy snowfalls and just plain storms. One of the things that's come up, I don't think it's been mentioned, so I thought I would just mention it to you so you all have it in your resources. We used ham radio operators, spread throughout the county. These folks are a wonderful resource that you may not have thought of. Now, obviously the cities probably don't need them too much, but if you're a rural county and you're spread out, ham radio operators are a wonderful resource in case you need communication.
Let me just say, that's brilliant. I will admit that you learn everything every day. That's would be mine for today. I think that's absolutely brilliant to use resources you have in the county to get the word out. Any more questions? Got one more right back there, sorry. Sitting next to the guy you just walked away from. I apologize.
Yeah, this on? Oh, there it is. Okay. I'm just wondering, because I'm listening to all of this, and then you lay on top of it disability, which I talked about this morning, and that can have a whole other layer. It was mentioned about, you know, having all the media outlets in the book and everything. Are you also making efforts to have a social media presence? Because a lot of media outlets don't necessarily reach some people with disabilities. But usually social media is another avenue to reach them.
It's a great idea, too. Thank you.
Agreed. Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you very much to the panel. It's never pleasant to think about disasters, but I think it's important to do so in advance rather than in hindsight. Now we're going to move the meeting into our